It's hard for me to find the Zoom link.
Jack, of course, that means I muted you too, so you have to unmute yourself.
Well, that was Gather to the Spirit by the UU songwriter, my good friend Jim Scott. Good evening and welcome to the regular third Wednesday Vesper service of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council. I'm Jack Reich, a minister with too many years' experience and now retired. We embrace all who come with a spirit of worship and invite you to remain after the service for conversation. And now it's time for announcements. Let me tell you that Friday, January 5th, is our next monthly board meeting of UU-MUAC, open to all. And don't forget the NAUA Ministers Support Group next Thursday, December 28th at noon. You can see the calendar at naunitarians.org for details. And now Richard will kindle our flame. And as he does so, let me say, may it symbolize for us the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. It is the mission of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council to carry out and foster anti-racist and multiracial unity activities, both within and outside the Unitarian Universalist Association, through education, bearing witness, and other actions, and expansion of our membership both within and outside the walls of our congregations. We also seek to defend our UU principles against those who would undermine them. We envision our congregations, denomination, and society as being not colorblind, but color appreciative, as judging and treating members of the world's rank and file by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their cultural heritage, and as treasuring diversity in the context of the beloved community. We call this vision multiracial Unitarian Universalism. And now we'll have an opening hymn with the lyrics on the screen, if I've queued up the right one, and I invite you to sing along.
But stay muted.
Yes, stay muted so we don't overwhelm the powers of Zoom. And now all I have to do is figure out why it's disappeared from my screen. So let me work on that.
You're muted, Jack.
Are there any other announcements, by the way? Okay. I've chosen a reading for this evening from a longer piece by Dr. Teresa Dumasi. I'm sorry, by Dorothy Furman, EDD. How to Practice Powerful Peace. She writes in Psychology Today, use the goodness, strength, and skill of your will to support peace. Peace is a practice that every person has access to, and one that improves quality of life individually and collectively. Holding peace as a way of life is not always passive. There are both contemplative and active ways of expressing peace. The warrior in oneself is most effective through the intention of peace, even when called into battle. More than 50 years ago, an Italian psychiatrist, a colleague of Freud and Jung, wrote this: a very important and urgent appreciation of the use of the will is that concerning the great issue of peace and war. In my view, no amount of political agreements and treaties or of external manipulation can by itself ensure a lasting peace. Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis, goes on to note that the effective means to change people's inner attitude, both individual and collective, is the constant application of the good will. It would have the effect of a magic wand. Expressed and applied, goodwill automatically excludes violent conflict and wars. That's taken from his book, The Act of Will. We'll now have a meditation followed by some moments of silence. With the grievous horrors of war that have been unleashed upon the world, it seems right that we take a moment in our worship to cast upon the waters of action some words of healing and hope. Spirit of life, in this horrible time of war, we would have peace. The Middle East situation is so convoluted, a permanent solution may seem out of reach altogether. But people made the decisions that have led to today, and people can make different ones. May the hearts of the Arabs and Jews be softened so that they can see the humanness in each other's visages and be moved to forsake the explosive weapons of destruction for a trial of compassion, forbearance, and generosity. These will surely lead to a more salutary outcome than more months, years, even decades of hostility and mistrust. And may we here in our nation, by showing love and caring for people on both sides of the conflict, help bring about the day when everyone shall sit beneath their vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. And likewise in the Ukraine, may wiser heads prevail among the Russian aggressors, that the terrible loss of life be brought to an end, and amity once again rule in the region. So may it be. Amen. Our speaker tonight is someone with whom we all would do well to be better acquainted. Sana Saeed, who shares her name with the UU official, is a vlogger with Al-Jazeera, producer of a series called Backspace. In this terrible time of vicious warfare in the Middle East, I thought it advisable for us to have at least one service devoted to gaining some background on what is going on over there. I thought you might appreciate Sana's perspective, why Israel matters to the U.S.
Israel is the victor. It is a pioneer, an innovator. It took a land without a people and made it blossom at the hands of a people without a land. Israel is necessary. Israel is a haven. It is moral. It is a democracy. Israel is America. Israel occupies, no pun intended, a unique position in the American news media landscape, in its political landscape, and, more than anywhere else, in the American consciousness and imagination.
So let me be clear about what I believe. I stand with Israel because of our shared values, which are so fundamental to the founding of both our nations.
Advocacy itself is not the cause of the bond between the United States and Israel. Its cause is the shared history and common values that draw America and Israel together.
There is an assumption of virtue, of a greater good in America's official history that has been consciously reproduced by Israel's advocates for a large part of the last century in an attempt to Americanize the Israeli project. And so when the curtain is pulled away to reveal the violence that upholds Israel's existence, there is an understanding from the United States of the necessity of this violence. Because Israeli violence is necessary to protect Israel from threats to its exceptional existence, just as American violence is necessary to protect the United States from threats to its exceptional existence. How Israel is covered in the U.S. news and popular media serves to obscure the biggest thing that ties the United States and Israel together. They're both settler colonial states which have been built on the displacement and ethnic cleansing of other peoples. And so to tell the story of Israel in U.S. news media has required for over 7 decades the disappearance of Palestinians, their history, and their right to their homeland. Because a cultural narrative about Israel where Palestinians and their history are front and center would also then require that we are honest about the violence that belies every part of the myth of American exceptionalism. Welcome to Backspace, where we tell you how the story is told in the headlines and then we think about how we can tell it a little differently. In the 7 decades since Israel was established as a state in the British Mandate of Palestine, American engagement, ideological, political, cultural, with the Jewish state has seen different iterations. But at its core, these iterations have relied on being a mirror of the American nation. And in that mirroring, Israel has been assigned a duality as both the victim and victor. Israel is a victor, emerging from one of the cruelest crimes of the 20th century as a successful, unified people who have built a formidable nation despite thousands of years in a persecuted diaspora.
Modern Israel was born in the aftermath of the tragedy of the Holocaust. It was created to fulfill the long-standing dream of the Jewish people to return to the home of their biblical origins.
Israel is a beacon of democracy in a sea of violence and hostility.
Israel is the most important technology force in the world next to the United States.
Israel is a victim, surrounded by enemies who want to drive it into the sea.
Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel is surrounded by countries and entities that want to drive them into the sea.
Tensions are rising after the deadliest wave of Palestinian terror attacks inside Israel in years.
It has the right to eliminate the cancer that is threatening its very existence.
There are many reasons why the U.S. has this distinctive relationship with Israel, but I think the one that is most important is actually cultural. That is, we have a long history of representing Israel as being tied to U.S. interests, but also to U.S. values, to religious values and democratic values. Those representations have shaped most of us in one way or another to think of Israel as more than just a strategic ally or a good military partner.
For a cultural history that extols shared values, it must build those shared values in opposition to other ideas, other values, and in the case of state and nationalist identities, other people. U.S. news and popular media have built a case for Israel reliant on the disappearance of Palestinians and any claim they have to their land, on the disappearance of their history of ethnic cleansing, the theft of their lands, and their ever-expanding diaspora.
It's a time of border trouble for Israel, and another incident on the Jordanian frontier results in a roundup of Arab infiltrators. Action that follows an attempt by these illegal entrants into the country to terrorize the Israeli populace living near this troubled line.
The militant Arabs claimed a territorial right to Jerusalem and Palestine that was 1,000 years old. But the determined leaders of Zionism pleaded a right that was even older.
4 Israeli settlers gunned down yesterday in the West Bank by Hamas, the Palestinian faction which opposes peace talks.
To return to Palestine would be to displace Israel.
We want to think about how Palestinians are not just entirely invisible, but made visible in a particular way, which is either as terrorists or as victims. If we think about the comparison between the United States as a settler colonial state and Israel as one, we can think about how people in the U.S. presented Native Americans. They were presented as disappearing, as not having political claims. Often people were very sad about what had happened to them, but what to do? Palestinians are not seen for a long time, but when they are seen, starting in the 1980s more, they begin to be seen as people who might have political claims, but the story of them is a story of people who are victims, who have a sad story, but Israel had to be Israel.
A counter-narrative to the American story about Israel that would be told from the Palestinian vantage point would also indict the sustained American histories and realities of violence against its indigenous and Black populations. Thus, Palestinians must be made into, at best, pitiful victims caught as collateral in Israel's attempt to defend itself, and at worst, as generation after generation of terrorist threats.
It doesn't really matter what the Palestinians do. They can blow up whomever they want to blow up. They can elect Hamas when given an opportunity to move forward. They can take one chance after another to recognize the state of Israel and their right to exist, and they will not do it.
The last few times that negotiations have taken place, the emphasis has been on asserting that Israel has been victimized by terrorist activities, by Hamas, by the failure of the Palestinians to govern themselves.
In both representations of Palestinians, the purpose of the State of Israel, the political status quo, and its carefully curated image remain intact. Even when Israeli crimes and transgressions beyond the expanding occupation, land theft, and apartheid are clear, Israel's moral authority isn't questioned. Questioning that moral authority is akin to questioning the necessity of Israel. So how did we get to this point, where deference to Israel's moral power is reflexive and unquestioned, a privilege not enjoyed by other countries and nations? It's too reductive to think that a pro-Israel lobby is alone in building Israel in the American landscape, that they alone have had this power. It's also not enough to look at U.S. foreign policy interests in the region as the sole determinant of Israel's narrative power in U.S. news and popular media. Both those things are central, of course, but what brings it all together is the cultural history of Israel in the United States, how Israel was understood by Americans in the aftermath of the Second World War, and how much of that has been a mirroring of how the United States sees itself. There's a tendency to believe that the horrors of the Holocaust are what led to American support and sympathy for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. But the late Dr. Amy Kaplan, in her 2018 book, Our American Israel, makes the argument that for Israel to be embraced by Americans, the idea of Israel had to be Americanized. She writes, Israel's proponents attributed New World meanings, symbols, and mythologies to a European movement to establish a Jewish polity in the Arab Middle East. They drew parallels between Mayflower pilgrims and Jewish pioneers in the familiar landscape of the biblical Promised Land, and they presented Zionist settlement as enacting American ideas of modern development.
In 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the George Washington of Israel, led his people and his country to independence.
And this mirroring, according to Kaplan, wasn't hard to do, especially when both shared a belief in their exceptionalism as signified by how they celebrated their anti-colonial origins, struggling against the British Empire and distancing themselves from the violent conquest at the center of their founding. Just as indigenous peoples are erased from the founding of an America free from British colonizers, Palestinians are mostly disappeared in Israel's founding.
At the founding of the Israeli state, there was almost no recognition of Palestinians at all. Even the word Palestinian was often used to refer to Palestinian Jews, people who had moved there. Palestinian Arabs were all but invisible. They were talked about only as refugees. The idea that they even represented a national consciousness was nowhere to be seen. So it was the Israelis who had the narrative of decolonization and nationalism behind them.
While some major news media like the New York Times were vehemently anti-Zionist, the narrative of decolonization and nationalism was embraced by many non-Jewish American liberals and progressives. They saw a Jewish state as the perfect rebuke to Nazi fascism, paralleling the official narrative of the US's defeat of Nazi Germany. They also saw Israel as an actualization of socialist ideals, especially with the establishment of kibbutzim and the Soviet Union's initial support for Israel. The Nation, a left-leaning magazine, was home to some of the biggest and most active support of Israel, and helped create the blueprint for how the narrative of Israel will come to be embraced in the United States news media for the coming decades, even if the Nation evolved its own position on Israel over time. The Jewish Agency, founded by socialist Zionists who helped organize and fund Jewish immigration to Palestine, gave the Nation a grant of $50,000 in 1947 for the purposes of, quote, conducting research and publishing articles and reports and promoting the Zionist cause among American liberals and foreign delegates to the United Nations. Emboldened by this, its longtime editor, Freda Kirchway, dedicated the pages of the Nation and its entire publishing institution to lobbying for the Zionist cause. Between 1947 and 1954, the Nation Associates, which was responsible for publishing the magazine, produced 12 widely distributed reports campaigning for the Zionist cause. Kirchway even wrote a 133-page memorandum for the UN on behalf of the Nation, making the case for Israel and tying the Arab Palestinians to the Nazis, which became a mainstay of liberal arguments against Palestinian self-determination thanks to her efforts. She ultimately even took credit for pushing the Truman administration into recognizing the State of Israel.
The Jews organized a government over there, and it's been a successful one ever since.
Now, Kirchway is just one of several examples of American media liberals and progressives who worked diligently and successfully alongside Zionist groups and leaders to make Israel into a liberal project and ideal that looked like the United States. And for every sentence dedicated to what a beacon and necessity Israel was as a pioneering nation of the so-called New Jew, there were many more dedicated to trumpeting the barbarity, jealousy, and backwardness of Arabs and Muslims. This early period of creating myths around Israel isn't the only critical era in the cultural history of Israel in the United States, but it is the bedrock of how Israel comes to be essentially Americanized in the eyes of the public. This is the time where there is buy-in from Americans from all different backgrounds that, yeah, maybe Israel is necessary. Maybe Israel is good. And following this period, we see tourism to the land of the Bible, which had existed well before Israel's establishment, flourish throughout the 50s and 60s, as do epic biblical films and the relationship between Hollywood and Israel itself. The 60s in particular are bookended by two critical moments that guaranteed Israel's positioning in both an American consensus about its necessity and goodness and in the U.S.'s foreign policy future. The release of the 1960 film Exodus, which was supported by the Israeli government and based on the novel by Leon Uris, and Israel's quick victory over its neighbors in the war of June 1967.
I think the book Exodus resonated differently for different audiences. I think for non-Jewish people, the book, but especially the movie, tells the story of Israel in an American register. It tells the story of Israel as the settling of a frontier. 1967 is an incredible turning point in Americans' views of Israel. Almost every newspaper or magazine has some joke or comment about how maybe we need to bring Moshe Dayan over to end the Vietnam War. Israel takes on this new vision or new version of a myth in the U.S. as an invincible and admired military power. So that image that emerges after 1967, that the U.S. should be both with Israel and like Israel in terms of foreign policy, I think is one of the structuring realities to this day in how many people think about Israel.
Palestinians during these years more or less disappear from having any claim, only significantly reappearing as so-called terrorists with high-profile acts of violence like the 1972 Munich massacre of 11 Israeli coaches and athletes, and then as victims in 1982 with the Israeli-backed massacre of Palestinian refugees in the Sabra and Shatila camps of Lebanon. And in Our American Israel, Dr. Amy Kaplan also, and most emphatically, notes that while we saw decades of Israel being Americanized for an American audience, following 9/11, we see an Israelization of the United States. We see a shift from the long-held, quote, admiration of Israel as a mirror of America's idealized self-image to emulation of Israel as a model for fighting America's worst nightmares.
It may take a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, but we will exterminate you.
Now, while there have been moments of sympathetic visibility of Palestinians in U.S. news media, there hasn't been a staking of the legitimacy of Palestinian claims. Israel, as it exists, always requires that its legitimacy, existence, and moral authority be upheld. So a Palestinian narrative about the Nakba, about apartheid, about the refugees and land theft hasn't even been allowed to be written in American cultural history. And that's been for many reasons, like Israel as an arm of American empire, anti-Muslim and Arab sentiments as fundamental to Israel's case for legitimacy, evangelical eschatology that's anti-Semitic, and of course the fact that the majority of American Jews fall into the category of whiteness. So how can journalists in U.S. news media engage with Israel and its role in U.S. history in a way that is honest and adheres to the basic principles of journalism, like punching up and never down? Well, it involves a lot of reimagining of how we've embraced Israel and disappeared Palestinians for 7 decades, based on whose humanity we've determined is worth more because of how it looks like ours.
I think there is a question of why it has been so hard for Americans to imagine that Palestinians have an absolute right to self-determination, that Palestinians, as much as anybody else, has the right to represent themselves, to have some kind of sovereign control over their lives. It is a bit shocking to me that it's been so hard for Americans to understand that. But I think it's a combination of Islamophobia, even though many Palestinians are Christian, many are Muslim, and that Islamophobia gets in the way.
In the pilot episode of Backspace back in May 2021, we broke down the sort of language that contemporary news media uses in coverage of Israeli occupation and apartheid, language that obfuscates not only the daily crimes committed by the Israeli state, but also the realities that Palestinians have experienced since 1948. But language is easier to revisit and rectify than an entire moral framework built on not only shared values, but ideations about a shared so-called Judeo-Christian heritage, about shared myths of revolution, about shared pioneering and shared exceptionalism. Good journalism about Israel that does what it's supposed to do doesn't separate Israel from its position as an occupying state and from its origins as a European settler colonial project born out of a European movement led by European Jews. Good journalism about Israel doesn't ignore what sustains Israel's existence as it is. The apartheid, Gaza as an open-air prison, the ever-expanding settlements, the checkpoints, the land theft, the incarcerations and killings of Palestinian youth, in addition to so much else that is meant to ensure that Palestinians never can have self-determination. Good journalism doesn't ignore Palestinians and doesn't question or belittle their claims to nationhood, resistance, and return when it does offer them some semblance of humanity and coverage. But for that kind of good journalism to happen, it needs to untangle and deconstruct the myths that tie together Israeli and American exceptionalisms. Otherwise, our journalism guarantees that those myths, which are used to justify the cruelties that sustain both Israel and the United States, are strengthened. And thus concludes another episode of Backspace. You guys are really the real ones for watching. So listen, we could really use your input. We're getting ready for another season of Backspace. Yay! I know. But we need your help. We want to know what are some other topics that are covered in US news media that need that Backspace treatment. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell all your friends, tell your teachers, tell your professors, tell your Twitter followers. We're here. We're getting ready for another season. And we'll see you very soon.
And now I've selected for a closing hymn something that you may be familiar with, but a rendition that you may not have heard. And I'm going to attempt to play that for you now.
We would be one, as now we join in singing our hymn of love, to pledge ourselves anew to the high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, where love and justice strive to make us free.
And now what we call our offertory is really a pitch for membership in our organization. And I'm not at all sure why I can't get you all back.
We can see you.
That's funny. I have no I
Can,
have no,
can you not see us? We
No.
can see you. Probably when I stop sharing the screen, you'll see us all.
oh, okay.
Let me stop sharing.
Okay. Yes, there you are. Go ahead, share it again, Richard. We don't ask a donation from those attending our monthly Vespers. Yet we do appreciate your gifts of support, for MUAC has expenses. Membership for a year is only $8.22. I'm sorry, 8.22 cents a day, 8 cents a day, or $30. Where else can you find effective anti-racism work for so little? You can find the donate button near the bottom of our homepage, uumuac.org. And be sure to fill in your personal data just below that. Now for our closing words as Richard extinguishes the chalice. Our service is ending. Next month on the third Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central, our speaker will be Terry Cummings. We don't have a topic yet. In the words of the late Reverend Elizabeth Sully Jones, whom some of you may have been privileged to know. Now we extinct, oh, by the way, our only words of extinguishing the chalice in our hymnal. Now we extinguish our chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And now after the postlude, which I've chosen to, well, lighten the mood just a bit, the floor will be open for conversation. Please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may find it under More with 3 dots above More, if you wish to be called on. Now, it's been our recent practice to stop the recording, but we decided to go ahead and maintain the recording so that those who come and view it online later won't be deprived of our words of wisdom. If you really object to being recorded, tell us before you start speaking and we will pause the recording. Oops.
Blessed days and the dark secret night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you.
Well, that's it. Thank you all for coming.
Nice job, Jack.
Thank you, Richard. Zoom gives us so many wonderful tools. It's really fun to play with. Well, I knew that tonight's service was going to be perhaps provocative. And I had a nightmare for a few days this week. I was reliving a service that I did at Meadville Lombard when I was a student for the ministry at the United Church of Christ Seminary down the street. And I thought perhaps I could bring healing to people. So I invited them to visualize someone with whom they were in conflict and then visualize healing the conflict. The wisdom of seminary students. And the history prof at Meadville, oh, help me out, people. I've forgotten his name. You know him. He died some years ago. And I can't think of his name. I'm blocking. And he came up to me. He had a lisp. And he came up to me after the service. And he was red in the face and angry. And he said, "What was worship about that experience?" So it left me with the thought that whenever I plan a service, there ought to be something about it that constitutes worship. I hope you found that today. Alan.
Okay, I do have to go pretty soon, so because I have some other things to do. But thanks, Jack, for the service. I thought it was interesting and tries to, reflect how Israel's been pictured in American media through the years and so forth. But I've been one of these people who's always wanted a, two-state solution. I think, I do want a Jewish state, but I also want a state for the Palestinians. And, obviously it's been a long struggle and hard to get there. But I always, I feel uncomfortable with times like this when you have people that are very vehemently either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine and not considering the, the needs of the people who are on the other side and wanting a solution. And it's difficult, and you wonder whether, there could be somehow a fair solution imposed from outside, because it looks like the people that are in there are not going to come to a solution on their own. And, we'll have a long, bloody future for a long time before some equitable solution is arrived at. But it's unfortunate. But those of us who want, justice for both sides, just, pray for a change that will bring that about, but don't know exactly how it's going to happen. So that's all I can say, really. So I'll be with you for about 5 more minutes.
Say something when your turn comes to.
Yeah. Dick Burkhardt has his hand up, Jack.
Yeah, I want to say something first before Dick, okay? I
course.
just wanted to say that, I'm pro-Palestinian because of what's happening to them. I mean, I can't, I think it's terrible what's happening to them, and there's no excuse for Israel to be murdering so many thousands of people, young, innocent children, and there's just no cause that could justify that. That's my opinion anyway.
Thank you, Mona.
And I wanted to say
I tend to agree with what Alan said. I've been thinking about this. What's a long-range solution? And with so much anger and animosity on both sides, I've concluded also that maybe something like if we got the United Nations involved, and we had maybe some kind of regional authority that could have actually a one-state solution, but overseen by an authority that would have the power to enforce human rights, so that neither side could, devastate the other. So they learn to live together. I think it should be one state. I don't think it should be a Jewish state. It should be one state. And if you look at the history of it, they say, well, don't they have the right to exist? But that's what this film pointed out. The right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state is a right based on raw power, just like the United States. The power of settler colonialism, of military power, of outside powers. There's no moral right. There's a right of raw power. But just like with the United States, are we going to give it all back to the Native Americans? No, it's when you have such a new regime, often what happens is you have to learn to live with each other, but the aggressor can do some compensation or reparations and things like that for the like in this case, the indigenous population that was so devastated. So I see that would have to be part of a single state solution overseen by an outside authority. But the other thing I wanted to say is that there's this extremely good book here. It's called The 100 Years War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017 by Rashid Khalidi, who's a Palestinian scholar. And it's very, very factual, very well documented view of Palestine that goes way back to the beginning of Zionism, and especially what happened right after World War I. And the film we just saw started in 1948. But you'll see the backdrop here is that after World War I, there was the Balfour Declaration that basically gave political control of Palestine to the Jewish Agency. Even though Palestine became a British colony, the Balfour Declaration said that the native indigenous peoples, they were just called non-Jewish peoples, would have civil and religious rights, but no political rights. And of course, that took a while to accomplish, but they accomplished it through a massive immigration in 1920s and 30s into Israel, because it had started out with only 6% Jewish population. And then there was also a lot of money that came in to buy out Palestinian properties and to take workers off the lands. And that's what led to a massive bloody revolt. A lot of people don't know about 1936 to 1939. That was the first major Palestinian war. It wasn't later. It wasn't 1948. The 36 to 39 was very, very bloody. They said something like 15% of the eligible men who were killed or wounded or something like that. And this was a revolt that came from the bottom, not from the leaders of the Palestinian community. The author of this book came from one of the traditional leading families, and he quotes from his grandparents were like mayor of Jerusalem and people like that. So he has the inside knowledge of all the things that were going on. But he says the leaders knew they were going to be in trouble because there was a British colony technically, and Britain didn't want to see the Palestinians successful. So just before World War II, Britain sent in a very large army. I think it was maybe 50, 100,000 armed men to put down this revolt, which came from the grassroots. And it was, say, very bloody. They eventually succeeded. But that's also when they trained all these militias, the Irgun and Ben Gurion and all these people. That's when the Israeli military power was developed in that war, because the British trained the Jewish militias to fight the Palestinians. And then we come to World War II, the British pulled back from this big endeavor because they had to fight World War II, and they didn't want to antagonize the Middle East any more than they had. So this created a huge damper on the immigration and things like that the Jewish people were doing in Zionism in Israel, to the extent that the Zionists in Israel started to see Britain as the enemy, which had been their patron before. They started to see them as the enemy, and after World War II, they became even more the enemy, and then Britain left the whole arena and gave it all to the United States. And that's where we heard some of what's happened since then. But it's a long history, and from the very beginning, they said there are a lot of records that showed that the leading Zionists knew their project of displacement. This homeland, they knew it meant displacement of the Palestinians, and a lot of the more honest ones and the military people knew that at some point it was going to involve military action to remove the people of Palestine.
Yes, thank you. By the way, I called on you earlier, but I had neglected to unmute myself. So it was a secret call. Julie. You're still muted, Julie.
Muted, Julie.
Thank you.
You got it.
I want to point out that propaganda is a huge factor here, and that some of that was mentioned, American propaganda about Israel, but there's much more. Palestinians learn in their schools how evil Jews are and how they ought to be wiped off the face of the earth. Plenty of Jewish officials, past and current, have stated they think Palestinians should just be wiped out. And so you have plenty of propaganda on both sides saying that the people on the other side are subhuman and like bugs. So the propaganda is extremely thick and heavy, and that's a big part of the problem. Maybe I'd say it might be the center of the problem. I wrote a blog post about on my blog, which I have up there in the chat if anyone wants to look at it, about propaganda and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. A big factor here is that Russia and Iran are involved in propaganda, actually pro-Palestinian propaganda. That's being done not because they care about Palestine at all. It's because they want to discourage people from voting for Biden through their sympathy for Palestine, and thus help Trump to get elected, which Netanyahu would love, because Trump is he just worships foreign dictators. He loves Netanyahu, and he would just let him do anything he wants and let him just completely write American policy toward Israel and Palestinians. So anyway, there is a ton of stuff going on with the propaganda. Also, it's important to note that Netanyahu and Hamas are on the same side. They're not on different sides. Netanyahu has supported Hamas. They help each other to be rageaholic power mongers, and that's their game. That's what they're doing. And also, I definitely agree with Dick's idea that I think outside authorities need to come in and help out and keep the peace, because what you've got here are two sides that are absolutely hopeless by themselves. Netanyahu is a corrupt right-wing type like Trump. He's an Israeli Trump, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, and it is the dominant party in the government of Gaza. And so either of these groups would keep peace from happening. Both of them together are a disaster. And that's why I think outside authorities need to come in and help with bringing peace about. Very much so.
A party, by the way, which has not allowed an election since 2005. So that's their commitment to democracy. Jay, I want to call on you, but first, I don't want to miss this opportunity to tell you about a book called No More Enemies by a lady named Deb Reich. And
Related?
if you notice a similarity to somebody who's here, yes, she's my sister, and has spent her entire adult life in Israel. She emigrated and became an Israeli in her 20s and has raised a couple of children. Her notion for Israel is that the two-state solution is not likely to work because basically it doesn't really give the Palestinians enough territory, and it rejects any claim they have to have the right of return, which of course the Israelis claim for themselves, even if they've never been there. Instead, she proposes a joint territoriality where there are basically two governments that rule over the same territory by agreement. A Palestinian government for the Palestinians and an Israeli government for the Israelis. And that this could work just as any peace treaty could work or fail, but it would allow for a continued governance of a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, which could learn to get along with each other, just like my Jewish family got along with our Catholic neighbors when I was growing up. Jay, what's on your mind? You're muted. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Of course, I came in here for just some light conversation. How heavy can this topic be, right, Pal? I think that the person who gave the talk will struggle. No matter what you say, there'll be something to say yeah and no to. Because I think this issue spans beyond almost anyone's comprehension or point of view. My only add to this is that because of multiple cable channels available to you and then endless commercials on many, I flip around and I've landed on Al-Jazeera since the beginning of the conflict back in early October. I'm not saying they're right, they're wrong, but you get a very different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's very clear that there is horrendous damage and death taking place right now. And it's just hard to balance the proportionality of this. And so my heart just goes out to everyone who loses a child, regardless of, quote, which side you're on.
And indeed, the Qataris have been the nation that has brokered these pauses in the bombing that have allowed for the return of some of the hostages and for a cessation of the bombing and the release of some Palestinian prisoners. And it's Qatar or Qatar that's the sponsor of Al-Jazeera. A lot of people don't know that. Richard has his hand up.
I'm reminded of a story about a very old man who went to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem to pray every day. And some young American reporter learned about this and she interviewed him and she watched him totter with his cane. He was a very old man, up to the wall and pray silently at the wall and then come back. And she interviewed him and said, I understand you've been coming here a long time. He said, well, more than 60 years. And she says, what are you praying for? I'm praying for peace among Christians and Muslims. And
asking questions. How is the community after the hearing the facts?
And she says, how does it feel to have been doing this for all this time? He says, I feel I've been talking to a damned wall.
Dick and Mona, if you'll forgive me, before I call on you, Ellen LaRue has her hand up and hasn't spoken yet. Ellen?
Okay, hi. I gotta say, I view this whole thing as a tragedy of biblical proportions. And I'm quite mixed about what I think about what, like I think the Israelis, that they should be able to fight to destroy Hamas. But I think I watched the destruction of of Gaza and the killings, and it's like it's almost it's impossible for me to figure out who's right. It's like I think both the two peoples need to be in this land, and they both well, I guess the leadership is one thing. The people may or may not be part with the leadership. I'm not really sure, but you think, my God, this is horrible. And so I'm just so grateful that there are people, the Qataris, actually, I think Biden, and other parties are working to keep it like under control, to slow it down, and to at least get things kind of at a simmer. I think that since both sides seem to be determined that the other side needs to give up, it's going to be a long time before we can have an actual solution. I think it's just going to be like hostilities for quite a while, and hopefully the people of the world that know how to do diplomacy will be able to keep it under control. It's just a mess.
From your lips to God's ear. Dick?
I was going to say something before.
Mona?
Dick.
Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say, Biden isn't doing anything to mitigate it. He could stop it simply by not supporting Israel militarily, the money funding for Israel's military. He could stop the whole thing if he wanted to.
Yeah, I want to say something different too. Is about this Hamas. Many people don't know that Hamas was basically created by Netanyahu and the state of Israel. And the reason is before their enemy had been the PLO. And they thought, oh, if we create another counterweight in Gaza over here, they can sort of take care of govern Gaza, and then there'll be a counterweight to the PLO, and we have a situation of divide and conquer. And so in this way, they have in fact succeeded in sidelining the PLO. But of course, I've read a number of sources that say that Hamas has mostly been involved in civil government in Gaza, but has this military wing. But because of the frustrations of the Gaza people, they have virtually no economy. 90% is just aid, really. And it's like this open air concentration camp. That's the way it's been described. Because of their despair, the military part of Hamas has grown in popularity among the people of Gaza, the Palestinians. So in a situation, if you get rid of one, get rid of the PLO, and then now say, well, now we're going to get rid of Hamas, that's not going to solve the problem. You just create a new force, you see, because that's the way the situation is. Unless we look at the long-range view, which is some of us have been talking about. We need a long-range view, something that's look out 1 or 2 or 3 generations. So there's none of this conflict. Otherwise, it's just cycling back and forth. Every few years, there's another war in Gaza when things have gotten out of hand, and they'll solve it by killing off Hamas. It doesn't
You
work.
know, wasn't it last year that Netanyahu won his most recent election? And you all remember, I'm sure, that in order to form a government, he had to take into his cabinet some of the most reactionary, fascistic, hateful politicians in Israel's history, including this guy, Yoav Alon, who's, I think that's his name, who's the defense secretary, and the other guy who's the interior minister, and I think one or both of them, I'm not sure, have been previously convicted by court in Israel of discriminatory practices and hatred of Palestinians. And imagine turning over the Interior Ministry and the Defense Department to these bigots. What could possibly go wrong? And then we've had the spectacle of the US President and Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, all of them, saying over and over again, well, we're sure that Israel is going to take whatever steps it can to prevent the excess loss of life in Gaza. And I'm thinking, are you fucking kidding me? These are people who have called the Palestinians human animals and have absolutely no regard for their lives. And they keep saying, and our diplomats, our office holders keep telling Israel, you've got to minimize the loss of life. And they say, oh, sure, boss. Oh, sure. We're going to do that. In a pig's eye, they're never going to do that. Their goal is to wipe them out. They'd like to kill them all. They're as bad as the Nazis. And, you know, until we have some cognizance of that, this may ruin Biden's chances at re-election. Richard, did you want to say something? You had moved over to top position a while ago. No. Jay Kiskell.
So I'm just looking at the 10,000 layers of what's going on there. I think the U.S. position, Biden, Secretary Austin, others, is to keep this from becoming a wider war. I mean, 2 U.S. aircraft carriers were pulled off to the shore there. That wasn't to support Israel. That was to send a clear message to Hezbollah and to Iran. I mean, this is a tinderbox of one miscalculation, and we've got a major Middle East war. So no one's going to do this perfectly. And Jack, I agree with you. The slaughter is just unbelievable right now, out of proportion. It's hard again when you watch Al-Jazeera, because they've had correspondence on the ground since day one, and there are a lot of dead children and families wiped out. I mean, it's just happening.
Well, let me see. We have approximately half of us that haven't said anything. I want to ask, I don't want to put you on the spot, Rachel Tedesco, but during the entire evening, you have looked very concerned and puzzled. I wonder, I'm curious what you're thinking.
Okay, well, thank you for noticing that. I'm not I find this very, very enlightening, very helpful. My background is that I am Ashkenazi Jewish, and I have relatives who live in Israel. I since married a non-Jew. We became UUs. What else? But I've been to Israel with my sister. We traveled around with Overseas Adventure Travel, which thankfully is not a religious organization. So we got to visit both sides, not the Gaza, but we went to Ramallah with this just diverse group. I mean, there were Christian, Jews, and non-believers. And the people in Ramallah were so welcoming to the tourists, and they were just so nice.
I just felt so bad because they were obviously living in great poverty. And when I saw in the news the walls go up between the West Bank and the rest of and Israel, I said, that's horrible. Why are they blocking them out? We didn't go to Gaza, but I just feel so badly about what's going on there. I know Netanyahu is a Nazi. I mean, these are just awful, awful. So I don't know. There's no easy, quick solution, but I do hope that the international powers, NATO, get in there and take control over the situation. That's the only way we're going to stop this. And then maybe in the long term, I like that idea of having one state with two governments. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to see how that will work.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you moved me to I see Julie has her hand raised, so I'll call on you, Julie. You're
Yeah,
muted.
I just want to point out that many of the things that people who are imbibing all the pro-Palestinian propaganda that's circulating, not that I don't have empathy for Palestinians, I do. I mean, they're going through a terrible slaughter, and Netanyahu is a corrupt right-winger. But the thing, one thing that people don't realize is that if you look at Palestinians and how they elect, the Gaza Palestinians, how they elected Hamas as the dominant force in their government, is because they were so desperate, because they were getting mistreated, slaughtered, etc. But the same thing is true of Israel. Most of the things that people say, oh, Israel should just do this for Palestine, and then that would be all taken care of. People, pro-Palestinian people very often say, have a list of things that should be done, pull back settlements, and offer Palestinians more rights, etc. All these things, or not all of them, most of these things have been done by past administrations of Israel. And the reason they have a right-wing nutcase, an Israeli Trump right now, that they elected their leader, is because it didn't work. Because Israel did all these things, they pulled back settlements, etc., and they were still getting suicide bombed. So, both sides have propaganda saying the other side is subhuman. Both sides have this situation where they elected a tough leader, a strong leader, which they thought the people were strong, but really they were just mean and corrupt. They were not strong in the sense of being a strong leader of the ordinary people of their country in the least. They're like total narcissists. So anyway, I think there's so much going on, so much hate going on both sides of their governments, and often many of the ordinary citizens too, that the other outside authorities, other people from other places really need to come in with love but firmness, that these powermonger, rageaholic governments of both places, stop screwing over the ordinary citizens.
Yes. Well, that's why I began the service tonight with a bow in the direction of our personal responsibility to see peace prevail by making peace ourselves. And obviously, the 15 of us who were here, the 17 of us who were here tonight can't bring peace to the Middle East. But we can begin by insisting that our representatives in Congress and in the cabinet implement and support policies that are likely to result in peace, such as, for example, a cessation of all military aid to Israel, which considering that their government has engaged in what are obviously war crimes, there's absolutely no justification anymore for us supporting their military machine. I see some of you who I know are vigorous thinkers, but you haven't had anything to say. I'm wondering what's going through your minds. Ken Christensen?
I'm wondering what's going to happen in terms of rebuilding Palestine.
Oh, yeah.
Another major challenge, such destruction. Now, I go along very much with Julie on this question of propaganda and everybody painting everybody else in worse colors. Nonetheless, everybody has got some really bad behavior going. And to get that toned down, I don't have a simple answer. I'm very bamboozled a bit. I do see the Trump forces pushing the Palestinian cause in order to decrease votes for Biden. I see that. It is a very practical thing for them to do. I would like to stop the fighting and get people to work together. You know, in my experience with political activity, if you can get people who are in the same community to focus on the same issues, you can get them to see that they have a problem and correct it and work together. But how do you get the people to work together? Again, Julie talked about some previous efforts in previous administrations to do this, and the question of why weren't they continued? Whenever you have a force going in one direction, you tend to have force pushing in the other. I don't have a simple answer. I'm listening a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Lincoln, I'm wondering what you're thinking.
Oh man, Jack, this is such a tough problem. And I think, by the way, the piece that you presented tonight was really powerful. I think that the analogy of creating myth out of the American experience, I can't get the word out of my mouth, and making it, you know, of colonial conquest, and then treating the Palestinians in many ways as we have treated indigenous people here, and for that matter, the Black people we imported, is a very powerful analogy. I think it is very strong. I've been reading the New York Times and the Washington Post I might start listening to Al Jazeera, that every day, you know, trying to just put my head around the horrendous things that are happening. 20,000 people now, I think, is how many have been killed, 70,000 wounded, many women and children, most women and children, and no real recognition of the disproportionality. I think Richard gave us a sermon recently, I can't remember, it was a month or two ago, in which he talked about the 7 times, you know, proportionality, or the 7 times 7 proportionality of sins being visited on the generations below. And this just, it blows it all out of the water. So I'm frustrated. I haven't said anything because I'm so frustrated, because I just don't know. I mean, I agree, by the way, that in the end, in listening to this conversation, what's required probably isn't going to happen, but what should happen is an elimination of both a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, and the creation of 1 or 2 governments. Perhaps they have to agree to pass any laws, okay, and probably it'll take some organization like NATO to enforce it, okay, but when is that going to happen?
Well, we usually end this Wednesday night Vespers at 8:30 Central Time, and it's past 8:30. So I would like to see a show of hands. I can't see Julie's or Wesley's or Sherilyn's because their screen is, they're not showing their screen, but a show of hands, all those who would like to continue the conversation as opposed to stopping right now. I'm going to vote for that. Okay. 1, 2, 3. And all those who would like to quit now. Two, 1, 2. Well, the talkers have it, so I'm going to let the conversation go on a while longer, as long as we're making sense and have a contribution. I would like to pose a question to the group, which now numbers 9, which is just about half of what we started with. Is there some resource or news outlet or book or series of articles that we haven't shared yet that you can point us to that will increase our understanding and our grasp of the problems over there, which obviously are not going to be simple or intuitively solved? Ken, your hand is up.
Yeah, in 2000, what, 3, 4, 5, when the Iraq War was going, I read, and I asked my students at the time, I was still teaching then, to read 2 outlets. One was Al-Jazeera, the other is Debka, DEBKA.com. Debka was an Israeli source. And just now, for the first time in years, I looked at Debka.com and noticed they closed down in July. But the last thing they're talking about with pictures and everything else is reasonability law passed, police mass against protesters storming the Knesset in July. You know, all the upset there. How do you get rid of a bad government? I don't know. I'm not sure what else they talk about. I don't know what I haven't read enough to know what their political position was there. Obviously, during the Iraq War, the Israelis had a definite Israeli position, and the Al-Jazeera had a definite position with the Arabs. But anyway, just for what it's worth, I don't know what's replaced, what other outlets are out there that I'd want to read. I did like Debka. I thought it was reasonably objective.
Yes, and how do you get rid of a bad government, a problem that we may be facing in spades in a little over a year?
Yeah, and that's another thing. When you talk about an outside force coming in and running Israel and Palestine both, who's going to watch the watchers? That's the ancient question. How does it not fall prey to political power, wealth power? You know, how much the freedom that the African nations gained from colonialism was soon rather moot when the forces of economic power came in and took over in many cases.
Yeah, I want to call on Lincoln, who has his hand up. Where did you go, Lincoln?
He's there.
Oh, there you are.
I'm here. I put my hand up and then forgot what I was going to say.
I know this happens to me too. I attribute it to almost 8 decades of life.
Yeah, in my case, going on 8 anyway.
Well,
young.
We want to hear from you as soon as you recover the thought. Rachel?
Despite the fact I said I didn't want to stay, but I am staying. I just wonder, I know that Netanyahu is losing popularity tremendously, and I wonder if the more moderate or liberal forces in Israel can somehow oust him at some point. I can't believe that they haven't had elections in so long, almost 2 decades, is it?
Oh, no. Yeah,
No, what?
The current government was elected last year.
Oh, okay. But how can he win when he has only a minority?
Well, I'll tell you what I used to tell my friends who would justifiably criticize Israel 10, 20, 30 years ago when Reagan was president or when Trump was president. And I would say, yeah, wouldn't it be great if they had a government more like ours? Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Oh, right. Well, yeah, no.
So, it's easy, as Jesus said, it's easy to criticize your neighbor for the speck in his eye without seeing the plank in your own.
Yeah.
And we Americans are very good at doing that, aren't we? I'm sorry, Lincoln.
Yeah, so Rachel, you reminded me of what I was going to say, which is that one faint hope that I have is that Netanyahu is being blamed for the massacre that occurred, and that he might be just unpopular enough to fail to get reelected, next time around. And the only reason he's there is because he made agreement with even more radical right-wing parties who are also smaller minority parties. And there was no way a majority of the more left-leaning parties could coalesce to form a government. And I guess he was asked to form a government because he had the most votes of those that were cast. But it's possible that there are many Israeli citizens who are very unhappy with him, and it's possible that he could lose next time around.
Yeah.
One can hope.
Ellen, before I call on you, neither Wesley nor Sherilyn has had anything to say yet, and I'm wondering if either of you would like to contribute something to the discussion. Are you there? Apparently not. Ellen, raise your hand if you would like to speak. Ellen, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. I think that the way I have become obsessed with reading and watching videos about this situation, and apparently, if you want to get a new a more left-oriented government in Israel, you got to do it quite soon, because the people that are most likely to be right-wing or reactionary have a much higher birth rate, and so demographically, what we're looking for an Israel that is much more like Netanyahu, which is kind of scary. And the other thing is, of course, the Palestinians have also a much higher birth rate than the kind of more liberal left-wing Israelis. So I think it's going to get worse.
I never imagined it would come down to birth rate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's ideas as well. So maybe ideas can take over, but. And the other thing is that one of the sources of basic facts that I have found to be useful is a man, a historian, an Israeli historian named Benny Morris, who is, I think he's quite even-handed. He is a Zionist, but he's even-handed nevertheless, although I still think to myself, he is an Israeli, so, there's an essential bias there, but he's giving facts, and I put these away as these facts are from Benny Morris, and we'll wait to see what facts somebody else presents. But I think he presents things in a very orderly way that is easy to follow, and apparently even Noam Chomsky has been known to quote him. So I figured that's a good sign.
Well, I want to thank you all for the quality of the discussion today. And I'll just point to two things. Nobody was cross or angry or hostile toward anybody else. The quality of listening was very high. And I think those are attributes which are vital to a conversation over such sensitive issues. I want to thank you all for bringing your best selves tonight. Is there anybody who's got what do you might thank you, Lincoln, a closing thought?
No.
Well, then, let me repeat my invitation to you to come back on the third Thursday night in January, when we'll hear from Terry Cummings, who has proved a popular. What's up, Richard? Did I make a mistake?
The third Wednesday,
What did I say?
Thursday.
Oh, imagine that. I don't even know what night it is.
Yeah.
The third Wednesday in January. And I don't know that we'll be having any special events between now and then, so I hope we'll see you. And let's all wave good night and happy holidays to you all. Have a wonderful end of year.
Ditto.
Thank you for coming.
Good night.
Richard, will you stick around for a minute?
Sure.
Thanks, everybody. Well, I noticed that that we had 7 or 8 people.
Let me stop the recording.
Oh, yeah. We had 7 or 8 people.